Fast as a leopard. How fast are you gonna run? As fast as a leopard. And let's see you do it.
30 years ago, I played the lead in the film Gallipoli. And that film became a classic tale of young men who went to war. My character, Archie, died in a hail of gunfire. Obviously, we were acting, but playing that part triggered a lifetime's interest in the men and women who did go.
90 years later, all we have to remember these men by are their names, carved in stone on thousands of memorials like this in virtually every town and suburb across Australia. There are so many memorials and so many names that it's easy to stop seeing them.
What I want is to look again and, in a sense, bring them back to life, to turn those names set in stone back into real people.
The battle was in Belgium. It was part of the fight to capture the hilltop town of Passchendaele. In just 15 weeks, almost 500,000 men would die for a gain of just a few kilometres. The weather was atrocious, and the wounded drowned in the mud.
Keith was in charge of his battalion or section, and he was leading the troops out to their designated area to participate in the battle. And he was wounded by a shell on the duckboards on his way out. So he was taken back on stretcher to the clearing station, and the other two boys would have witnessed this. The idea is that the boys basically went out in vengeance, that their brother had been injured. They would have seen the extent of his injuries, which were quite severe, and they possibly placed themselves in risk out of an emotional vengeance. But the other two bodies were never recovered. The artefacts for one of the boys, Theo, were returned, but for George there was no...
There was no trace.
Nothing, yeah, nothing came back. So the only one of the boys that has a known burial is Keith, the one that was taken back to the clearance station, and he died the next day.
Mm. This is with Keith's...
Yeah, Keith's belongings, yeah.
That's Fanny.
That's a picture of the boy's mother, Fanny, that was with Keith when he died, so that's a shrapnel hole.
Oh. So this came back with his belongings.
Yeah.
And Fanny got all this.
Yes, she'd relive it all again, wouldn't she?
Oh, that's his grave.
So that was the original grave in Belgium. They had to write a lot of letters to get that photograph. Probably the most important aspect of it for me personally as a younger member of the family is that all of these family artefacts we've got have flesh and bones, they have meaning. They're not just three boys that died in the family 90 years ago. That these men had a real story behind them, and all these belongings are just so important in our family.
So when the news finally comes back to the family, can you tell me what sort of effect it began to have?
Grandmother apparently was the stronger of the two. Grandfather had a nervous breakdown and he couldn't accept it at all and was crying out for his boys. They couldn't manage because there was the three older boys that were bringing in income were gone, and now he wasn't bringing in income, and it had a dramatic effect in every way on the family.
Even just the shock of it.
Prove ourselves on the world stage. Add to this our moral outrage at Germany's invasion of Belgium and France. In 1914, Ballarat was a Victorian town with Victorian architecture, Victorian values and Victorian ties to empire. Built on the wealth of the gold rush, you only have to look around to get a sense of pride and ambition, the grand vision on which this place was built. Compulsory cadets was part of the school system, and this town already had 2 infantry regiments, like the Army Reserve. So when the war came, Ballarat was ready. More than 4,000 men and boys volunteered, but peace came at a high price.
Of the 60,000 Australians who died, nearly 2,000 came from Ballarat and the surrounding areas. Almost 1 in 30 who lost their lives were Ballarat boys. In every major battle we fought, at least one Ballarat boy laid down his life. And on the Western Front, they died in appalling numbers. Ballarat was not going to let them go quietly. At the end of the war, they erected this grand arch of victory, a statement of pride and achievement. It's an impressive gateway to the town. And it stands at the head of an avenue of trees. One tree planted for every man who enlisted. The Avenue of Honour stretches for 14 miles. A bit of a dungeon. Oh, look at this.
I've managed to trace Victor Lepp's great-granddaughter, Andrea. Before I contacted her, she knew very little about her great-grandfather. I've brought her to the archives of the local newspaper, the Ballarat Courier.
Oh, my goodness.
I'll give you a hand.
Amanda Taylor, a military historian, has researched every Ballarat soldier and has discovered Victor's obituary.
And we'll take that upstairs to have a look at. Oh, wow. There he is. Oh, goodness. Yeah, 1917, by the time news actually came through to confirm that Victor had been killed. And the quality of the photographs was so good, they're so real.
They are.
Your great-grandmother says, in sad and loving memory of my dear husband and daddy, Private Victor Lepp, who was killed in action in France on the 26th of April 1916. His king and country called him. The call was not in vain. On Australia's roll of honour, you'll find our loved one's name. His sorrowing widow and child, Francis and little Vic.
Oh, goodness. Makes it incredibly real, and you feel her pain and what it must have been like looking at her son and knowing that he'd never, ever meet his father. It's incredible.
Were cut off, and they decided to fight to the end.
I knew them all personally, as they were in my platoon. We're in our first line trench and had orders to take Mouquet Farm. They got into the trench, but the Germans came up from behind and they all got cut off. The sergeant and all his men took shelter in shell holes and all fought to a finish. We think the majority of them were killed, as they were determined not to be taken alive.
Incredible. It sort of makes you wonder, though, fancy even being in that position, being put in that position.
And until you...
Pozier remained engraved on the survivors' memory. They had seen mates blown to pieces, go mad under the shelling, stagger back shell-shocked, and even shoot themselves. Years later, when Clary's grandchildren encountered racist taunts about their Chinese background, he would explode angrily. Ask them what their family ever did in the war.
When he died, you know. He was buried at sea off Perth somewhere.
Percy never got to meet his dad.
That's Jimmy just there. That's a ship he was on when he died.
Right. He looks really crook there.
Yeah.
Because he was gassed.
We used to have what they call a dead man's panty. It was a great big bronze, about as big as a plate.
Which you've probably seen is the...
Yes, that's one.
That's the one.
That's it. Where'd you get it from?
Well, another relative, a Jimmy Rubenak.
Yes.
There's another one of you.
My cousin.
Cousin, yeah.
He gave you this, did he?
Well, he's loaned it, so he's loaned it.
Yes.
But I thought maybe you should have a look.
Just faced by different circumstances at a different time. It's easy to let these stories slip into dim and distant memory, but the First World War was less than 100 years ago. It starts with a name, and it's been profoundly rewarding to discover who these men were and to ensure their lives are not forgotten.